Welcome to Stoic Conversations. My name is Caleb Ontiveros.
I'm Michael Tremblay.
And today we're going to be talking about the Book of Five Rings, in particular the second book, second ring, I suppose, the Water Book. This is from Musashi, the Japanese swordsman from the 17th century. And it's a work that has a number of commonalities with Stoicism and is worth thinking through because it's a Zen-inspired book that's been exceptionally influential in the martial arts community, as well as perhaps people interested in philosophies of life generally. So this is the second installment of that series. We're going through the Water Book today.
Yeah, great. I really enjoyed the first one that we did on this, and we talked a little bit more about Musashi's background and the historical context of that episode. So if you missed that one, do go back and start there. But this is my first time going through this book, Caleb, and really enjoyed it. You know this, but for anybody listening, I have a martial arts background, and my family business is a martial arts gym. That's what my dad does, and so I kind of grew up in the dojo, so to speak, and it was interesting reading this book and seeing how much of that philosophy, we were talking about this, Caleb, but I always thought growing up when I discovered Stoicism, there's a lot of Stoicism in martial arts. And now that I'm reading Musashi, I think, wow, there's actually just like a lot of warrior Zen in martial arts culture, which makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of the way Musashi talks about how to live, the analogies he makes between the pursuit of fighting art and how to live. There's a lot of that in contemporary martial arts culture. And that obviously overlaps with ancient Greek philosophy, with other schools, other ways of life. But I almost feel like I've, in reading this book, kind of connected with a set of axioms or kind of paradigms for viewing the world that have been taken for granted in martial arts and are kind of laid out explicitly here. And so that's been a cool experience, and looking forward to doing book 2.
Excellent. Yeah, so book 2, Book of Water, that's about the fundamentals like the previous chapter, but goes a little bit more into more details about basic techniques of swordsmanship, but also mindset and principles. So we'll just go through some of the items lessons, aspects of Musashi's philosophy that stuck out to us. Sound good?
Yeah, and then I took the way that I took it is, if book 1 is about general strategy, this is about swordsmanship in particular, like the craft of sword fighting as a subsection of general strategy or winning.
Yeah, I think that's correct. That's certainly correct. The first book, there's this idea that strategy is the same thing throughout different crafts, but Musashi does distinguish. He argues for that and also distinguishes some of the different crafts or different kinds of lives from one another. So, whereas this is just about swordsmanship. And it begins with mindset. So I think a striking principle from Musashi is that your mindset should not differ from your everyday mind. In life or in strategic moments, without changing it even the slightest bit, make your mind broad and straight. So there's really this call to globally apply this way of strategy to every endeavor, whether it's swordsmanship, ordinary social interactions, eating breakfast, you keep your mind broad and straight. And that brings to mind the Stoic precepts around managing impressions and always being awake, right, to the impressions you're receiving and responding to them skillfully, not going slack, as it were.
Yeah, and that's those are the very first lines in this book you just read, and then he carries on and says, without trying to rein your mind in too tightly or letting it go slack at all. Have it in such a way that it does not lean in any particular direction, and set it quietly vibrating. And that I thought of when I think about like that Stoic view about the Stoics have this idea versus we should always be questions trying to get closer to the truth. But then there becomes this, you learn that very quickly in studying Stoicism. You get across that idea very quickly if you study Stoicism genuinely. But then there becomes this harder question of like, well, how do I do that? How do I become the kind of person that can do that successfully, even when they're frustrated or they're stressed or things like this? And we get, I just love that description from Musashi about, you take your mind and you don't rein it tightly or let it go slack. You don't let it lean in any particular direction. You center it and you set it quietly vibrating. So it's kind of, it's moving. It's got this potential. It's got this kind of small motion, but it's not biased too extremely in one direction. So yeah, absolutely agree with your idea about that's the way you should, Musashi's point about that's the way you should carry yourself in all things. And then we get a bit of a description of it that I really like, that kind of quiet vibration, not leaning in any direction.
Yeah, absolutely. You neither agitated nor lazy or passive or something of that sort. And I think the use of physical metaphor is useful and perhaps I think is something one sees throughout Zen or different Eastern texts. I think seeing the mind in this way, but perhaps one doesn't get as much in the Stoic applications of thinking about the mind. What do you think about that?
Well, the Stoics, they don't use the physical metaphor, but the mind is physical for the Stoics, right? Like a passion is an expansion. So when I feel angry, my soul kind of expands. Or when I want something, so in anger, I want revenge, for example, my soul kind of expands towards the target. And when I'm fearful, I'm anxious, or I'm depressed, my soul constricts. Like they literally think your soul is changing shape when you experience these things. So the idea of centering yourself and having a quiet vibration, that to me is that I'm not. It connects well with the Stoic metaphor.
Oh yeah, you're right. I think that's a great point.
Okay.
There's another nice line on mindset right in the next section. At quiet times, your mind should not become quiet. And when for some reason you are hurried, your mind should not become even a little rushed. Your mindset should not be affected by your body, nor your body by your mind. And I think that's a useful, that just brings to mind this idea of not letting your mindset, your judgments being determined by the environment, your body, what have you, which is a difficult, of course, but an essential goal, I think, both for Zen and the Stoics.
Yeah, I mean, this comes back to that idea of impressions that we were just talking about, where if you're not, the Stoics think that, what the animal does, what the child does, is they receive impressions and then they react to them instinctively. They don't have this ability to intervene on their action, change the trajectory of their beliefs or their behaviors, or reflect on how they're acting or what they feel. So you think about that. If you're stressed in the house, your dog is going to become stressed. Their dog is going to respond to that anxiety. They're going to feel that energy. If you're rushing, your child is going to pick up on that, and it's going to impact them. And so this is that picture of, how do you become the kind of person who you don't respond to those impressions automatically. Your mental state is separate from that external environment, as you said. I think it's a great point. Something we lose track of when we think about putting ourselves in the best position to act strategically, as Musashi would say, or act virtuously, as the Stoics would say. It's harder to do that if our mind is rushed, or it's harder to do that if our mind is quiet, which you described as lazy. We don't think of quiet as a bad thing nowadays, but lazy or not quick to act either.
Well, so at some point on mindset, which is also connected to Musashi talks about energy, rhythm, and I think this sort of idea that, of course, he's talking about swordsmanship. But he's talking about more than that, where it's pretty clear how your energy and the rhythm of your cadence, your opponents, and such matter. But I think that the lesson sort of extends a little further than that as well. So another section here where that stood out to me is understand thoroughly how a small body can be large in spirit, and know completely how a large body can be small in spirit. Whether large or small, set your mind straight. Having a mind that is not controlled by your body is essential. And that's an extension of the previous point, understanding that the shape of a body shouldn't necessarily influence your mindset, of course. But also this idea of being large in spirit or small in spirit. Perhaps there's an idea of willpower behind that, or someone has maybe a kind of force, or whether it's charisma or even just physical energy that extends beyond their physical size, and that being important to convey.
I like that idea. Well, it reminds me of Epictetus's points about you think, well, I'm so great, I have a nice car, or I have a big house, and it's like, you didn't tell me anything about you. You just told me about your possessions. I have Epictetus' example as a horse. It's like, stop bragging about your horse, tell me about you. And I see that idea of, you're not great, you're not tough, you're not strong just because you have a big body. And again, he's meaning this in the sword fighting. It's this very kind of masculine fighting context, but it's like, you're not a great, strong man just because you have a big body, and you're not weak just because you have a small body. There's the mind. That is the more important part, but then also not allowing it to be controlled, right? Not feeling weak just because you have a weak body, and not assuming you're strong just because you have a strong body. Yeah, I think those are critical points.
Yeah, they're critical, but there's also a potential tension, because at once he says, look, your mindset shouldn't be determined by your body, but of course your posture matters. Sword fighting is a thing that's done by the body. So another important principle is you should distinguish the idea that your body should determine the state of your mind. But I think if your mind is proper, in the right state, your body in a way should reflect that. And thus posture, the way you carry yourself, does have some essential importance. And he's really quite detailed about how, you should hold yourself, do not wrinkle your forehead, but set in a crease between the brows, so that you do not blink or move your eyeballs. Narrow your eyes a little and soften your gaze placidly. And it goes on, he offers other precepts. Straighten the sinews at the back of the neck, putting a feeling of energy into the hairline there. I like that level of specificity. And he also thinks you should carry your posture throughout your day in a way that's appropriate, of course, but similar to the opening section where your mindset, this mindset of strategy should be carried into everything. So should this sort of view that posture matters, the way you carry yourself should be, I suppose, reflect this project of being strategic for the Stoics, being virtuous.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So I've kind of tried to set this up as a dichotomy. And what I took from what you were saying, Caleb, is like, it's not a dichotomy. It's not like you have the body and you have the mind and they're totally separate, which is the way the Stoics might take it. They might say, you can chain my leg, but you can't harm my mind, as Epictetus might say. But Musashi's quote was, having a mind that is not controlled by your body is essential. And so basically he's trying to as I understand that, he's critical of having your body influence the strength of your mind. But he still thinks having a strong body is important, but that can flow from a strong mind, or you can at least strongly influence it from a strong mind. And so I can't, if I try to put that, I wouldn't want to be the kind of person where, I have an opponent and they're way bigger than me. And all of a sudden I get kind of cowardly, or I get a physical injury. And now all of a sudden I think, oh, there's no way I can win the fight anymore. And this is kind of my mind being influenced by my body. And that's a mistake. But because sword fighting is a physical skill, yeah, you need your body to be in the right posture, the right positioning. You just want to stop the influence from body to mind. That's what that makes me think of. Do you think that's more accurate?
Well, no, I think that's right. I do think the Stoics agree with this as well, but it might not be as obvious, because you could take that first point that the mind and the body in a way should be independent of one another, and perhaps conclude that therefore the posture of your body doesn't matter. And I don't think the Stoics would believe that, though. And Cicero, in fact, has a quote from On Ends. I think it's the last chapter of On Ends, where he states that a posture that communicates sobriety, steadiness, a sound mental disposition, and a purposeful use of the body is considered to be in conformity with nature. Almost brings a moral dimension to your physical posture. Sounds like something Musonius Rufus would say as well. And I think that would be consistent with the Stoic line.
Yeah, I agree with you. So I'll throw out I'll throw out this division. I was being too strong. Posture matters. How you hold your body matters. Just don't let yourself get broken, cowardly, or feel weak, because of something that happens with your body. You can kind of, the mind, a strong mind is kind of like sufficient for a strong mind. It's kind of like a self-contained thing. And then you can use that to have, the hold yourself the right way, stand the right way, hold your sword the right way, so to speak, which obviously matters. The Stoics would agree with that, as would Musonius.
Yeah, it's almost as if a strong body is evidence for having a strong mind, even if it's not conclusive. And of course, there might be different circumstances where this is just a point of adaptability, where of course different forms of posture are required. And one doesn't always need to, perhaps in the swordsmanship, it might be good. In some cases, it might be good to deceive one's opponent by taking on an apparently poor posture or something of that sort. And so there's another section where Musashi says, regarding your physical carriage and strategy, it is vital to make your normal everyday posture your strategic posture, and make your strategic stance your usual stance. I think that's that idea of taking this project and applying it globally through your life. Which in some sense, I don't know if that's good advice all the way through, but yeah, go ahead.
You shouldn't crease, lower your shoulders, make your back straight without letting your buttocks stick out all the time, or narrow your eyes a little so that you don't blink or move your eyeballs all the time. I agree, not literally, but charitably, strategy for Musashi is kind of like virtue for the Stoics. It's trying to do well, trying to live properly, trying to win. Maybe it's a bit more outcome focused than the Stoics would place it, but it's about doing your best for the best outcome. And so it's just I think there's this idea of not making this gap in the way you think or in the way you hold yourself between these, moments of battle and the moments of everyday life, because, you should be thinking strategically in all moments. Your everyday posture should be strategic. Your everyday mindset should be strategic. Which comes back to what you were saying at the start, Caleb, of, you should always, the Stoic would say, you should always be, carefully examining your impressions. Your life just is your everyday, the culmination of these everyday moments. And so that's that requires just as much attention and focus as these kind of big pivotal moments. It's interesting coming from Musashi as a sword fighter who, fought to the death, because you think, well, is it really as important? You really don't think I should have a kind of different posture in these moments of these battles as I do every day? But, he's arguing against it. He also has this, at the end of your quote, Caleb, he has this line, for those that haven't read it. He goes, "You must investigate this thoroughly." And that's the kind, he throws that at the end of, when he thinks he drops a banger and he's like, "This is a good one." He just is like, "You must investigate this thoroughly," which I like, because it's like, it's basically this idea of like, what reading this sentence is not sufficient. Like, I've pointed you in the direction. You need to kind of practice this. Your everyday posture should be the same as your strategic posture, but you must investigate this thoroughly. Like, there's still work to do, which I enjoy.
Yeah, I think you have to do your own homework, as it were.
Yeah, exactly.
You see that phrase again and again, or the alternative phrase you'll see sometimes in 2 sections after that in my translation is, "This takes serious practice. To understand your opponent's sword but not look at it at all, it can be said that this too is an extremely important thing in strategy. This takes serious practice."
Yeah, I like that. It's just like, this is not, reading this book is not sufficient, is something that I agree. That's the way that I think about self-improvement. I think that it's theory and practice. Those are two things that are required in unison, and that gets called out explicitly here.
Yep, absolutely. There's another point he makes that is obvious, but takes practice, requires, I think, consistently reorienting yourself, which is, be direct with your purpose. And here, the purpose of sword fighting is, your sword is a thing for cutting down your opponent. That's your goal. So when he talks about things like positions, he'll say things like, "Do not think of taking a position. Think of cutting your opponent," even after covering different positions. Likewise, you're not thinking about belonging to a specific school, a specific school of martial arts or a specific school of swordsmanship, or being married to specific techniques. So I think this is a point that applies throughout, practice, training, remembering to keep in mind that goal, which is, when in a sword fight, cutting down your opponent. And also, of course, in performance, when you're in battle, keeping that in mind and not having your mind go quiet and losing sight of that goal, having a kind of purposelessness, or on the other side, grabbing onto purposes that are not relevant to the situation at hand. So I think that's one of those things that's, in a way, obvious. You want to be direct, you want to be focused on what actually matters, but in so many different scenarios is easy to lose sight of.
Yeah, I mean, this really resonates with me. I think of Bruce Lee. He had this fighting philosophy as this, Jeet Kune Do was his style, but it was this kind of rejection of styles. It was incorporating sparring and then whatever is effective from any sort of style towards this goal of, I'm not a Jeet Kune Do expert, but this goal of fighting effectively. And I think about the early UFCs, Ultimate Fighting Championships, where people came in and they had these styles and they had these preconceptions, and you basically introduced them in this open competitive environment around this idea of there's this single goal of winning. And there was this iteration towards a better style or a new style, and you saw the strengths and weaknesses of all these other styles. I bring this up just because it's a martial arts example with Musashi. It's about fighting, and he's saying this hundreds of years ago about, you have this goal to cut the person down. It's not the two sword style. It's not your master's style. It's not the technique that focus. You don't name the technique anything specific other than it is the person cutting technique, and kind of centering everything around that. For me, at least as a martial artist, that's kind of framed as something that was invented the story I've heard before is that was invented by Bruce Lee, or that kind of philosophy came about with Bruce Lee, and maybe it was iterated in the Ultimate Fighting Championships. But you're seeing that coming through here, which is, I think it's right, but it's well before its time. And then that, in the philosophy equivalent is you try to think about how to live well, and that's the goal. It's not no sort of style. You never compromise that goal in the pursuit of any sort of style.
Right. Or different areas of life. There's the aphorism, it's better to be right than win an argument, because those are two different things. It's better to see the world as it is than come away as the victor in some rhetorical debate. I think it's maybe even Epicurus who has a line to something to the effect that, the person whose mind was changed in a debate is a real victor, since they've come away with knowledge, whereas the other person likely believes what they believe to begin with. And I think that's always useful. Maybe that specific aphorism, perhaps sometimes it is better to win an argument, or being right's not always the most important thing in many conversations, but having that, whatever that telos is of a given situation, that's worth keeping in mind and not being distracted by whatever it is, some desire to be seen, proven as correct, or giving into social conformity, whatever it is. Just a reminder to keep in mind the telos of your different activities, and not being distracted by purposes that are irrelevant, or perhaps sleepwalking through whatever it is and not even grasping onto any purpose at all.
Yeah, the telos, that's a way that ancient Greek philosophy gives us a language to talk about these kinds of things, right? There's the purpose. The telos of sword fighting is cutting down another person, right? There's this purpose, there's this function, keep it in mind. I looked up a quick Bruce Lee quote, and he says, again, let me remind you, Jeet Kune Do is just the name used, a boat to get one across, and once across, it is to be discarded and not to be carried on one's back. And so you study this martial arts style to help you achieve this telos, this goal, but you don't carry it on your back. You don't have it as this burden that carries you down or restricts you from achieving that goal or telos. And that's that same idea Musashi is trying to get across here is remember the telos of sword fighting, or whatever you do. That's not a word we use. That's not a word we use anymore, but that idea of purpose or function, it's something I do in my day-to-day life all the time. I think, like, why am I here? What am I doing this for? We don't name that when we talk about the typical Stoic exercises, but that for me is a helpful exercise that I do. It's just like recentering on the telos, or the function of my task, or what I'm trying to achieve. And it helps me kind of not sweat the small stuff either. It makes things less stressful, because often that's maybe where the obstacle is the way comes in, because if you really understand the telos of what you're doing, things that are frustrating you are not impeding that telos. If you really understand your goal is to learn how to sword fight, learn how to cut a man down better, often struggling with a specific technique someone has taught you, so now you have to change the style to fit your body type. That's not harming the telos. It's only harming your ability to copy somebody else or copy someone else's style. And so that's kind of, maybe we subsume that exercise under that obstacle is the way idea, but I do think about telos a lot. It is a part of ancient Greek philosophy that's really stuck with me.
Yeah, that's well put. I do think it's if that's something one could keep in mind throughout one's day, that would be in every moment. And that's something Marcus Aurelius calls himself to do. Is keep his purpose in mind at every moment. That would be a good way to have a good day, I think. Really. Did you have any thoughts on, so there's a longer section in this book that's specific to sword fighting. There are forms Musashi talks about, and he goes into detail about the sensations related to those forms, how you hold your sword, your opponent's stance, and so on. Did you have any thoughts on that section?
I don't remember having any strong thoughts on it, because it's kind of just like, he's like, there's five 5 ways, the 5 orientations or positions. You can be raised, middle, lower, to the right side or the left side. Those are the only 5 ways to stand. And so no, I mean, to be honest, I kind of was like, okay, this is just sword specific. Again, I'm not practicing sword stuff. I want the life knowledge. But did I miss
I'm
anything?
not sure unless you're going to be challenged to a duel anytime soon, but the yeah, I agree that it's sword specific. It is perhaps focus on general principles over techniques, which is something you would expect Musashi to do. He says these are the 5 ways you might, stand or something with this sword, or you can hold a single sword or 2 swords, instead of thinking about maybe more specific techniques, although he does discuss different forms of cutting and so on. Or it's not perhaps as technique focused as other approaches might be. That's something that I thought if I think about different approaches of teaching martial arts, something you have a technique in its isolation, or other people who might be a little bit more conceptual and say, think about this position. These are the sorts of things that matter. There are different ways to get there. And Musashi seems a little closer to that second form of instruction, which I think is what you'd expect.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think the conceptual, but even in this book, he blurs the line, right? He says, he has the teaching of position, no position. So we can talk about things as positions, but we also, in a way, there's not positions, because you can take the raised sword position where your sword's above your head and you can lower it a little bit. So it becomes this kind of middle position. You can take the sword that's on the left side and pull it to the right. So it becomes kind of a middle position, or is kind of both of these things simultaneously. He says, accordingly, there's a principle that positions both exist and do not exist. And then above all, when taking up swords, no matter how you hold them, it is with the intention of cutting down your opponent. So, I mean, maybe a way to say this, maybe somebody who's better at sword fighting could jump in here. But there's almost this view of different ways of looking at the same coin. And, you can talk about it from the top or the side, and in one sense, you're talking about something meaningful. You're carving out an aspect of reality. But in another sense, there is no real, it isn't a binary, and there isn't some sort of extreme distinction between, coming from the left or coming from the middle or the top or the bottom. There's just this like kind of intention of cutting someone down. So, I mean, that's vague. I don't know if that's the most succinct way of saying it, but I read it as just that warning of there's different ways of looking at this thing, but that doesn't mean they are, binary, discrete, maybe not binary, but discretely different things. There is a kind of fluidity between them that makes them blur together. And you want to also keep that in mind as you get more advanced.
Yeah, that's well put. And you could perhaps a better way to put it, instead of making this distinction between concepts, techniques, is that he applies that Buddhist parable, everything's a boat that you take on your way to the shore and then leave it. Everything's just instrumental in that way, perhaps. You use it for not to belong to a specific school for some social reason or because it gives you personal satisfaction, but you use it for the purpose of the task. And also there's probably a deeper sort of metaphysical point that the distinctions between these things are blurry themselves, concept versus technique, posture, positions, and so on. And that's at least one reason why it's essential to be, focused on the purpose.
Yeah. I mean, I like that boat example, going back to the boat example of like the left-hand position is a way of thinking about fighting for the purpose of improving. It's almost like an intermediary way of understanding things. And then you drop it if you don't need it anymore. And you don't say, no, I'm in the left position, so I have to do these 3 techniques. And this is the right way you fight from the left position. And in one sense, that might be helpful for an intermediate, but there's a truth that there is no left position as well as the existence of a left position is both true and not true, depending on the angle you're looking at it from, um, or your level of progress. I think if we ground this in Stoicism, if I take a step back and think about this in terms of Stoicism or the philosophy of life, I mean, I'm seeing so many great analogies to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or skills, the other kind of physical skills I take up. I think he's making these great points. But if you think about lifting, living, not lifting, my other great pursuit, living, it's we don't want to hold too strong to any kind of concrete rules. I don't know, concrete rules. Well, what would be a way that a Stoic practitioner would put this into practice? I guess is my question, or put this idea into practice is what I'm trying to think of.
Well, there is the Aristo position around, which is related to this, which is sort of even rejecting precepts. And we discussed that many episodes back. There's no universal. I don't know if Stoics would necessarily agree with this, but sort of having a question mark around a lot of principles, they're in a way they're underspecified. So I won't make a strong claim that there are no universal Stoic precepts, but many aphorisms from the famous Stoics themselves don't apply in every situation, or they're specific to certain circumstances. And that's just because reality can be so complex and detailed. And, if you think about Epictetus's role ethics, that's a way of trying to make sense of the detail of the world, and in a way perhaps other moral philosophies don't. Instead of saying, there's some certain rules you can follow in every situation, maximize expected utility or respect people's rights. It's, thinking of your role in that specific situation, maybe even roles, and then just letting that guide your behavior. And that's going to be flexible between people, cultures, times. So I think that's one way perhaps of getting at it.
Yeah, I think that is a good way of getting at it. Precept was that idea I was trying to get to. Yeah, and so there's this idea of, you should be kind to your neighbors or something, and you can think of that like a certain position you're taking or a certain technique you're using. And one way to approach the beginner is probably good, applying the good techniques. But the advanced swordsman isn't really applying techniques, right? They have a telos in the moment that they're using their skill to perceive and to work towards. And the Stoic is doing the same thing. They're not the skilled the skilled person is not looking for, well, what's the technique I can apply here? What's the Stoic phrase I can apply here? So much as they are just, understanding the kind, just, wise thing to do in the moment. Yeah. So that, again, it's the giving up the boat. The precept is the boat, right? It's giving up the boat that helps you get across the water.
Nice. Yeah. One of the concepts I wanted to talk about is this idea I touched on earlier of rhythm. And there's a few places where Musashi talks about this, especially towards the end of this chapter. He writes, "Perceive your adversary's rhythms and understand where they fall apart, and you will win." He also writes, you pull up to this section again. A few pages later, that's not the right section, sorry. A few pages before that, he writes, "If the enemy's mind is on getting his body out of the way, you've already won." So there's a kind of mindfulness to awareness of the other person's mindset that comes through, the rhythm of sword fight, which is obvious, or maybe obvious isn't the right word, but sometimes people in martial arts talk about the importance of setting the rhythm in a fight. You don't want to always be on the defensive. Of course, you want to see if you can try kick off an offensive cycle, not get stuck in defensive cycles. People do say things about this in combat, and I think that absolutely makes sense, but it also matters in conversation. Conversations have their own rhythms. And there's a kind of attentiveness that I think if you took Musashi's philosophy seriously, you'd bring to things like conversation, and that would help you pick out, the speed at which you interact with other people. People who are very socially talented, even, the rate of speaking, how much they interrupt and so on, these sort of minute details probably do a lot to, make people feel comfortable or at peace when they're with that person. So I think that's a nice, this concept of rhythm, I think it is a nice one to think about, especially in interactions with others, but perhaps there are ways you can extend it to, thinking about, the rhythm of your life and how you can get out of a slump, avoid parts of your life when you might be in too frantic of a state. So I think that can be a useful concept to explore, investigate thoroughly, I suppose.
Exactly. This must be practiced. I mean, I like the idea. I think philosophical types, or at least me, I'm kind of analytical. I don't like this idea of using this discussion of like energy. That's never like resonated with me. But as soon as you pull it over into a physical metaphor, all of a sudden it resonates with me, right? And so there's this kind of idea of movement, of being frantic or being slow. And I like your point about being responsive to the movements of other people. Are they being frantic? Are they being slow? What are they responding to in terms of their movements, their mindset? That's what you were making me think of. And there's a kind of intelligence that comes with picking up on that rhythm and movement in terms of a way to be good to other people and in a way of navigating situations skillfully. Agree with that. I think those were good points. The other thing this makes me think of is the quote you said. It was, if your opponent's thinking about moving out of the way, you've already won. And there's a lesson there about the telos again. But, you're supposed to be thinking about cutting somebody down. They're thinking about cutting you down. And if you can make them think about not getting cut down, if you can make them think about defending themselves instead of cutting you down, you've disrupted their mind. You've taken their mind away from the telos. And now you have control of the situation as long as you can keep their mind off the telos. And I think that's an important lesson offensively. And then it's the inverse of that is the defensive lesson, which is you need to keep yourself thinking about the goal. You can't let people throw your mind off the goal. You can't let people disrupt your rhythm. And so we think of somebody getting frustrated, angry, bitter. It's like something in your external life has thrown you off your rhythm. That's somebody that was rude, was an unexpected event, a bill or an accident or a sickness. Has that gotten you off your rhythm? Has that gotten you off your focus off the telos, right?
Yeah, that's another great point. I think you can take this as an offensive or defensive lesson. Awesome. Anything else you want to pull out from this chapter?
Just they're like, and then it's just funny quotes about sword fighting. I was just pulling through now and reading. Stabbing in the face. This is what is meant by stabbing in the face. When you face your adversary in between his swords and blows, it's essential that you constantly remember to keep the feeling of stabbing him in the face with the tip of your sword. Yeah. So if you have the mindset of stabbing your opponent in the face, he'll try to get both his face and body out of the way. Well, and that gets back to what we're talking about. But I don't think anything else in particular to call out, but just we talked about this a lot in the first episode. Just an excellent example of how if living is a craft, expertise in one craft provides expertise in living. Not necessarily, because in the words of Musashi, it needs to be studied thoroughly and practiced thoroughly. But you get insight into how to win at anything by getting good at one thing. And so, when you're reading this philosophical text, it's funny to read about, you've got to think constantly about going for the eyes. But there is a lesson there about, keeping your opponent off rhythm, keeping them off keeping them their mindset off the telos or off their goal and putting them in a defensive posture and avoiding that yourself. That's a good that's a good lesson on rhythm for anything.
Awesome. Cool. Well, let's end with last section of this chapter, which I think is appropriate. Forge yourself with 1,000 days of training and polish yourself with 10,000 days of practice. This is something you need to investigate thoroughly.